friends, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and today I want to talk about Bandit Rule number 4. Anansi, what you did there. When I wrote down my list of rules to cover for this series, I actually forgot about this one, but then ludicrousness reminded me about it, and thinking about this rule made me so angry that I actually reordered my list of videos to talk about it immediately. This rule makes me so mad, almost as mad as the time someone recently betrayed me. This is a rule that some people may view as a pet peeve, but I strongly believe in its rule nature. Cards should never overtly advertise or draw attention to problematic interactions. This is a rule best explained by example, and one of the most famous examples is the Anansi clause of Anansi. You cannot play any copy of that action again this turn. You cannot put a clause like that on a card without forcing a player to ask why it exists, because it means there is a problem. In my opinion, to the best extent possible, cards should not come with band-aids or problems, but rather elegant solutions that answer problems you don't even know exist. Now, I fully accept that this isn't always possible. When you have a fixed limit, like a Tenacious Z or Water Lily, those make sense. You can't have zombies playing 6 power for every free burst. Could you have solved that problem another way, like Tenacious Z being played on a base where you have no minions? There are benefits and detriments to this, especially in the zombie context, but hard limits I accept most of the time. But these aren't hard limits, they are acknowledgments that there is a problem with an interaction. So why do I believe in this rule so strongly? Because the proposed solution is almost never correct and penalizes the wrong card. Let's look specifically at Anansi. This clause exists because Anansi could search for any standard action, then you could play collecting stories to play it again. With a card like Time Walk, this would be super abusive. But who is the actual problem here? It's not Anansi. Time Walk goes to the bottom of the deck, begging it to be replayed again and again. Anansi wouldn't have to worry about the card being played again if collecting stories didn't exist. In fact, this is the root internal problem. I love Anansi Tales. They were my number 2 favorite faction in my last ranking, but I have always had an issue with the collecting stories gimmick. You can give someone a card, get benefits for giving it away, and then immediately replay it. There was no consequence to giving it away, quite the opposite, and a player never had a chance to use it. That's not sharing, that's staging. So instead of taking a hard look at collecting stories, Anansi takes the penalty, and the clause is written so strictly that it creates an issue. Sometimes this can be avoided by an order of operations. If I have a card I want to play in hand, I play that first, and then I have Anansi play it from the deck. But this isn't always possible, especially when drawing cards is involved. Consider the case where Anansi plays On Guard, which is played on D'Artagnan. You draw 2 cards as a result, and start a chain that hopefully draws more cards. What if one of those drawn cards ends up being the other On Guard? You can't play it because Anansi says so. But the circumstance is fundamentally different. I'm not playing it from their hand, I'm legitimately playing my other copy I couldn't have played before because I couldn't access it, and now I still cannot. With drawing cards, this happens quite often because if you use half of your turn setting up, you may as well really set up for the future, but you can't. But it's interesting because Anansi has 2 attention callouts because it's easy to overlook instead of where it would normally go. While this wouldn't be an issue for an action like smuggling, it's clearly an issue for Time Walk, and once again, Time Walk gets away unscathed. Another card that has this problem is Sun Tattoo. Sun Tattoo requires that no actions are on the minion. This has the unintended consequence of allowing a player to play a meaningless action on a minion to stop it from getting Sun Tattoo, because Sun Tattoo on Sun Tattoo was deemed too strong. But then it's fair to ask, why is Sun Tattoo even a double feature? You can argue that an Ocean Tattoo Wayfinder growing 2 counters per turn is too strong, but that's a ton of power creep that can be exploited if you don't draw Sun Tattoo fast enough. And the Voyagers have Tattoo Artist, which wants to draw and play tattoos, which Sun Tattoo is not a fit for, and the other double feature is also a tattoo. It just shows that the Voyagers had a balance problem, and instead of trying to tackle it elegantly, they avoid it in a way that ends up hurting the faction synergy and can also penalize them heavily. If this rule is followed correctly, then there are cards that players don't even realize came close to violating it. I don't know what it was about Culture Shock, but Rumpelstiltskin and Volcanic Uprising came close several times. Volcanic Uprising at one point was basically a chance to start the game with 5 VP before anyone took a turn, and it kept getting clauses to try to prevent this. They stood out tremendously, and it's fair to ask, what are you trying to accomplish with this card? If you have to say things like, you can't play any more cards this turn, it means something is broken, and we shouldn't be drawing attention to it. By far, the most famous example, and I won't say which card this was, in order to prevent an infinite loop, the card actually had the ability to, instead of draw the top card of your deck, to draw the second card of your deck. That's crazy. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that there is no shortage of creativity or card abilities, so I'm not sure why it's necessary to go to elaborate hoops to get an ability to work when you can just use something else. An example of this is Signs in the Stars, which was a holdover from a unique take on base modifiers that Incas used to have but ultimately dropped. This card went to great lengths and a ton of card text to avoid problems, but does this really help ancient Incas? They can't control it that well, and it's clear that, by giving the players the opportunity to turn it off, there are some combinations that are game-breaking. Conceptually, this can be a fun card, but with some of the bases out there, it's clearly problematic, and I just ask, is it worth it? Going back to penalizing the wrong card, I find the Collector Errata to be really funny. The Collector can cause an infinite loop on Homeworld, but rather than errata the Homeworld, which has plenty of infinite loops, they errata the Collector, the easiest one to facilitate it. And the funny thing is, a Collector returning itself on the right base would actually be strategically viable. If the base or your cards on it provided value for playing there, but you didn't want to lose access to that benefit, this would be a good idea. For example, Lunch Run is on Subterranean Lair. You get a free play because you have no minions, and you keep getting that free play because Collector takes itself out. So every turn, you get the benefits of playing there because Collector isn't there to block itself. On Fairy Circle, maybe you really need double actions but don't want to accelerate that base. If a player uses their minion play to take themselves out of play, that's not inherently wrong and could be strategically viable. They errated the wrong card in a way that draws attention to the infinite loop without actually stopping it. A copycat of a Collector can still loop indefinitely. And you still have at least 3 auto wins with Minions of Cthulhu, and countless insufferable loops otherwise. And because of the refusal to errata the Homeworld, there were some, in my opinion, crushing clarificatas on otherwise interesting cards like Grave Situation and Escape Hatch. Another card held back by its own limitations is Ninja Acolyte. Obviously, Ninja Acolyte cannot be allowed to loop itself indefinitely, or other Ninja Acolytes, but Synergy ends up blocking itself. The game loves playing Power 2s as extra plays, but Ninja Acolyte will rarely get to trigger its ability on the same turn it was played as an extra play. In fact, they block themselves when they are the first minion, and you cannot do multiple Acolytes even in a non-loop capacity. What seems like a solution to the loop actually creates more problems for playing the card legitimately. Sometimes these type of issues can't be avoided. For example, Disguise Penguin went through multiple iterations of wording before the hard limit was applied. But have you ever noticed that it's 3 power? Sometimes a change of power is subtly an indication of an issue, especially for minions where the power doesn't actually matter. Sometimes the details are not in the card itself, but the clarifications. The most famously infuriating example of this is Aramis, whose clarification states that it does not work with Last Stand because we shouldn't have cards in the same faction working together. Famously, in what I call During Gate, this is caused by the ever-changing definition of During, where During meant only your play card phase in International Incident, which broke other cards, but if the definition of During changed, does Aramis' clarification change with it? With Aramis being confirmed for the World Champs, this question takes on even greater significance. It begs the question of why Musketeers were even given Last Stand at all if Aramis was worded this way. If you aren't willing to take advantage of the fact that ongoing has meaning outside of Phase 2 and even your turn. One of the byproducts of following this rule is that you start to see limits harshly and not merely once per turn limitations, which I obviously get. I maintain that almost all cards that say up to X are chosen arbitrarily. Take Wasabi for instance, you can only go up to 5 power. Why 5? Probably because it felt right, but it ignores the greater question of what was causing it to be an issue without that cap. This is also true of Research Lab Beacon. By limiting the card to having 4 minions on a base, it shows how powerful a Talent Sea Dog style card is, and it isn't stopping there from being more than 4, just stops future movement after it. In what is clearly meant to be a card that wastes rival minions, if you have 4 of your own and wanted to bring over others for efficiency, you can't. This doesn't feel like an elegant solution to what seems like a very powerful card. Imagine this with High Ground. Everyone is going to die. It almost feels like the card should have gotten power counters, and you remove power counters to facilitate the movement with the ability able to trigger up to 4 times. One card that I feel successfully avoided the rule is Kree Sentry. Kree Sentry used to be a mini Heracles, getting 1 power for each action you played. But with the Kree, this could be really strong, so a request was made to cap it at 2 times with a very ugly up to 2 times clause. Why just 2? Why not 3? Instead, what we argued for was mostly objectively worse, but infinitely cleaner and gave purpose to what the card wanted to do. You get 2 power if you played 2 or more actions that turn. It doesn't feel like an arbitrary limit, but rather a direction for how to play this faction. Go for the big play, and Kree Sentry will support you and make it more efficient. While the abilities cap out at the same time, this version doesn't feel like it's acknowledging a balance problem. Some may not think that this is a big deal, but a number of people, not just me, fought hard for this ability, cementing the rule. Again, in the Kree Sentry case, Kree Sentry wouldn't have been the problem, the extreme action chain is, but this is a great compromise. In a game this lengthy in life, with all of its complexity, there are bound to be difficult interactions. But how we choose to solve them matters tremendously, because sometimes it feels like the game is trying to fit a screw using a hammer. Often the wrong card is punished for older cards' mistakes, or other cards in the faction, and it creates issues during real games because a faction is in 100% of its own games. Sometimes you see an oddly worded reference to a minion and wonder why it's necessary, even if it doesn't cause any problems. And then there are cards like Fortress Walls, where you just shake your head and sigh. You may not think there are many examples of this rule being violated, and that's because of a lot of the work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that the rule is followed. Do you have any examples of cards that stand out? How do you feel about this rule? Is it a pet peeve of Bandit, or a legitimate issue? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.